In this section, we will learn how to make our web components listen to and react to events. And we will begin our section journey with the very first video, Introduction to Event Listening. So for freshers, let's first understand by what do we mean by event listening and what exactly are event listeners. So in technical terms, in HTML terms, event listeners are basically events like mouse click, and event listeners, as it goes by the word itself, listen to the events. So as per the definition, event listeners listen to events. And when we say events, mouse clicks, keyboard button pushes like when you press a key, or mouse hovering like how I'm hovering over this image. So how do we add event listeners to web components? So event listeners can be added by selecting an element and then using add event listener, attaching the add event listener followed by the name and a callback function to it. This name can then be called using methods like onClick, onHover, or just by dot click, dot hover, and so on. So now let's quickly move to our code and try to understand how we can bring about modifications and add events and event listeners to our web components. And remember, we had commented out our blog model. So now before we go ahead and start adding events to our web components, so we will first begin by uncommenting our blog model and styling it so that it looks presentable when we finally show it in our application and add an event to it. So when we go ahead and refresh our screens, this is what our blog post blog modal looks like. So let's first go ahead and bring about some basic changes to our modal. So we'll go to blogmodal.js. Before that, I'll create a new file called blogmodal.css. Go back to index.html and then I will add a link rel style sheet. So from what we learned about dynamic styling, we will cut this, paste it. Let me just close all of this. Go ahead and remove the style elements. Save it and refresh the screen. So as we can see, we have retained our styling, which means the external style sheets are working perfectly. So now let me just go ahead and add some more styling to our modal component. So I'll begin by restructuring our modal element. I'll now add a wrapper or a super parent class. So this will wrap our modal, and I'll also add an overlay. Overlay means the tinted grayish semi-transparent background that you more often than see in every modals. So now that we have restructured our modals, let me quickly go back to our blog modal.css and add some styling properties. So I'll begin by adding the property to the super parent. Next, if our parent does not have the class called open, it should remain hidden. We'll make the position fixed with 70%. We remove this and add some extra properties. A Z index of 500, some background color, border, box shadow. So you'll save this and refresh. So now our web component has vanished because we've added the visibility hidden to it. Now I forgot to add one more property. Let me just quickly go and add the dot overlay, which will now have a black background but a semi-transparent, a little less on opacity. And finally, I'll also be adding a close element. So now when I go and refresh my screen, you cannot see. It's because we do not have the class open with our wrapper. So let me just go ahead and add this and refresh our screen. So I made a mistake. The opacity here should be 1. Let me just save this. And now add a class open so that you can see the modal. So you see now we have the semi-transparent dark overlay and a close button as well. So this bit of our CSS code handles the visibility part. If I do not have a class called open, our modal remains hidden. But if I do have a class called open, so our modal will be visible. So now at this moment, we do not want our modal to be open because in an ideal scenario, our modal will always be hidden by default. So now that we have saved and changed the styles to our modal, now let's quickly add an event listener to our code. So for that, as you remember, we need to do this. So first, let's get all the card elements together, and we can do that. So what we need to do in our application is that whenever a user clicks on any of these cards, a modal should open with the brief story about these particular titles. So now for that, so we need to assign a click to these particular cards. So for that, first we need to get hold of all the cards. So using this particular code that we have here, I will get all the cards. So let me just quickly console.log the cards. So the moment I have refreshed my screen, you can see that I have now got an HTML collection array pertaining to each blog card. So a rule of thumb, even though the HTML collection looks like an array, you cannot use for each inside the HTML collection. You cannot use for each for DOM events. So for that, we will quickly copy the entire HTML collection into an array using the spread operator. Then we go ahead and run a for loop, add an event listener, click, and on clicking, we should be shown a message in our console that the card is clicked. So when I save this, I go back and refresh. So this is how you add events to the web components.